Welcome back to Overnight America. With all of the different changes when we had a transfer of power between the Trump to the Biden administration, a lot of executive orders going around, and still a lot of them seem to be focusing on regulations and restrictions because of the coronavirus and our efforts to try to fight that. Joining us now is Litigation Counsel for the New Civil Liberties Alliance, and we're going to talk a little bit about the CDC and the power of that organization during this time. Caleb Kruckenberg, thank you so much for coming on to KMOX.
Thanks for having me.
The CDC seems to issue a lot of statements and actually try to force all kinds of things when it comes to regulations over the coronavirus. And I'm curious from your stance, what are some of those things that the CDC has power to do and things that they certainly don't have power to do?
Well, the CDC is a public health organization. So, I think we can all get together and say, well, maybe they should be, making recommendations about health policy and about, things we can do to actually mitigate disease. And, it's typically about research and maybe quarantining things, quarantining people if they're sick or something like that. But what the CDC's done is they've taken that mission and they've just gone way beyond it. And you mentioned the eviction moratorium. And, for those of you who don't know, back in September, the CDC said states are not allowed to have housing court, and they're not allowed to evict tenants for non-payment of rent. And if states allow people to go through that process, their own state court process, it's now a federal crime, according to the CDC.
There's a lot of question to that because sometimes they would want to start the process knowing that they wanted to evict someone, but the processing wouldn't happen. They wouldn't serve. They would know it would go nowhere in court. I didn't realize it got to the point where you'd be committing a federal crime to try to go forward with that. And there was a lot of examples where it was just flat out terrible, the conditions of some of these living quarters. And they would go through, and even locally here documented, where it was terrible. It's like a bomb went off inside these places, and then the landlords were just helpless to do anything. Now they extended out even further, and it made me wonder, that's a weird type of order for the CDC. You think it would come from another agency, but even though if it did come from the CDC, is that even legal? Are they allowed to do something like that?
Well, the short answer is no. And you're right. I mean, it's been devastating to a lot of people. I represent a number of people in a lawsuit over this CDC order right now, and my clients are just suffering. They're landlords who haven't been paid in some instances for going on a year now. And you're right. I mean, their properties are being destroyed in some instances. But the CDC just doesn't have this power. There's a law that Congress passed back in the 1940s that says the CDC has some very limited authority to take emergency measures like quarantining livestock, impounding goods, potentially stopping people who are sick from moving around the community, and that's pretty much it. And the CDC has said this actually gives us the power to do anything we can think of as long as we argue that it's for public safety. And so they've decided that an eviction moratorium is in their power.
We saw other agencies try to use these wide-breaching kind of broad stroke laws in the past. And what comes to mind to me is the EPA would try to do that, where they would take things like navigable waters and they would try to use it as a giant land grab and overregulation. And I think, man, we've really set the stage for all of these other organizations to take the same suit, go out there and use it as a way to overregulate. And you got to realize that if these poor landlords, I feel bad for some of them that they know that it's going to be very difficult for them to recoup some of the losses with this. I mean, imagine if you're an individual and you're going to be back 6-7 months rent, like you're going to ever be able to pay that back. Now think of all the other litigation that's going to be held up when they have to try to recover some of that. It's just going to be a complete mess in the courts.
Absolutely. And, an eviction is really the only choice that a lot of landlords have when their tenants aren't paying, because for the most part, if tenants had money, they would pay. I mean, nobody likes to go through the eviction process, but sometimes at the end of it, a landlord will get a judgment and they never expect to get that money. I mean, we all sort of know the reality of that situation. And what's happening now is, for a lot of my clients, they've had to provide free housing for people for, like I said, almost a year. That's tens of thousands of dollars that they'll never see. But they cannot get that person out. And now when it's still the end of March and they can't rent the apartment, they're just losing money every single month. And, some of them I don't think are going to survive. I think they're going to lose their, because they have mortgages of their own, I think they're going to lose their property and it's going to get foreclosed. I mean, that's the fallout.
Yeah, if you were to even look at this a little bit further and realize the repercussions of what could be happening here. So let's just say, hypothetically, there are a lot of people, I don't know if it's in the millions, that are behind in rent. We'll just say hundreds of thousands, because I'm sure there's a lot over this country, and between the rents and the mortgages and things like that. So what happens when eventually this moratorium is lifted and they are eventually served papers, and then finally there's a backlog? It could probably even take longer to try to get through some of those, because who knows how long it'll take for them to go through all of the evictions at one time. Now, let's say there's the individuals that are now no longer allowed to be in these residences. They're told to leave. And then what happens? They're going to have to live somewhere. So what's going to happen is they'll apply to go somewhere else. And you think that landlord's going to pick that person up? They're going to say, okay, you're back on 9 months of rent, like you're ever going to be able to pay me. So then what happens? So I think that we're putting ourselves in a very dangerous situation down the road.
Absolutely. At the end of March, this is going to be a catastrophe. I mean, there are going to be all of these people that are going to face eviction suddenly. It's going to be a huge number because it's been gathering for the last year, and these people aren't going to have any place to go. And, this is not a solution. And I think really this just illustrates what happens when you have an agency like the CDC sticking its nose where it doesn't belong. They're setting nationwide housing policy, and they're telling states that they're not allowed to pick their own policy. And it shows that this is not their expertise. They don't know what they're doing. And what they're doing is they're shifting a problem onto, they're picking winners and losers. They're saying, it's a problem that people can't pay their rent, and we're going to make that the landlord's problem only, and we're going to make them pay. Yeah. And that's not the way government is supposed to work.
Yeah, there is a debt there, and it's going to be something I'm sure the courts are going to be overwhelmed for a while. And even if you're a homeowner and you think, okay, I'm fine, I'm good, I have a mortgage and everything's fine, I'm not worried about this rental situation. Well, let me just throw this out there too. Imagine there's a flood of people that are evicted, or they lose their homes or their ability or whatever it is. Think what happens when there's all of this availability and no one wants to move into these places or can't because they can't afford to. Then what does that do for the housing values when there's a flood of people trying to sell homes, or there's eviction, I guess foreclosures, things like that? We're going to have another housing crisis because all of a sudden your home is going to lose value because the availability is going to be so high, and it definitely is going to drive costs down. And there's not going to be people there lining up to buy them. So this could hurt a lot of people.
Right. This is going to have, I think, repercussions in our economy for years to come. And it just didn't have to be this way. And to the extent that there's a problem, I mean, obviously people are out of work, and we all live in the pandemic. But if the solution to this problem needs to come from Congress. Congress is the one that is supposed to be making these decisions. It's not administrative agencies. It's not the CDC telling states that they're not allowed to use their own state courts. That's just wrong. And it's wrong because the CDC doesn't have that power, but it's also, it really goes against the constitutional premise that when we give people access to courts, when we give people court process, we can't just take it away from them. We can't tell them you're not allowed to go to court anymore.
Yeah. I wonder how this will be remedied. And as much as we're throwing money out like crazy, money we just don't have, but we're throwing it out. I wondered if there was a way, and I don't even know if this could be done with renters, but if it was any other thing and you owed someone money, they would just put a lien on your property. And I'm thinking, wow, could they do that towards a future tax credit for some of these people? Because ultimately, the government's going to try to bail out as many people as they can to try to fix this. And that's going to be probably the fourth or fifth stimulus package down the road. And everyone else is looking at it themselves and thinking, man, we just can't afford this. It's a mess that we're making a lot worse, and we're making it too hard for ourselves. Well,
no, I agree. And
yeah.
And so, I want to say there is hope, because the reason probably I'm talking to you is my organization, we're fighting this. We're fighting this in the courts. Like I said, I'm representing a number of landlords, and we believe this is unlawful, and we're pushing forward a challenge to try to set this precedent, not just in this specific context, but we're trying to get the precedent out there that agencies like this can't just extend their power like this. They can't stick their nose where they don't belong.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, too, any other industry, if it was the auto industry, if they could do, hey, you can't be without a car because of an emergency. So all leases, if you stop payments on your car, we're not going to repo them or whatever. And we're talking about property that's owned by someone else. And that's very dangerous when the government sweeps in and says you don't have the authority or power to control your own property, even when it does violate the agreement you had with someone else. So just real quick, the new Civil Liberties Alliance, if people wanted to find out some of the things you're fighting for, where can they go?
So go to our website, nclalegal.org. We have information about the eviction moratorium, our litigation there, and other cases, because as you said, this is something that a lot of administrative agencies do. They do things like this. And my organization exists solely to fight against administrative overreach.
Very good. And it's important because there is a lot of overreach. We need people paying attention to this. And that's why organizations like this and people like you that come onto the show and talk about some of the concerns that you have. Caleb Kruckenberg, thank you so much for coming on to KMOX.
Thank you very much.
And he joins us on the Bomarito Automotive Group guest line. And I think that we know that this is going to be a lingering problem. I don't think we believe that when this moratorium is lifted, everyone's just magically going to have all the money to hand over the money that is owed. So that puts people into some pretty terrible positions all the way around. And think of it this way, too. You're just adding more debt to yourself, and you owe it to someone, and they're going to have to collect somehow. It's not like you're going to get it forgiven, because then what? Is the government just going to pay the landlords? That doesn't work either.